Ask the expert why diversity matters in cancer clinical trials.
My name is Craig Lockhart. I am a medical oncologist at the Medical University of South Carolina. I specialize in taking care of patients with gastrointestinal cancers. I have many roles here at the Medical University of South Carolina, including leading the clinical trials enterprise for the Hollings Cancer Center.
Let's start by asking, what is a cancer clinical trial?
Every drug that we use in the care of cancer patients was developed in a clinical trial. Clinical trials, in general, are responsible for anything that we take medication wise at all. For example, immune therapy did not exist 23 years ago when I was a brand new oncologist. Now, immunotherapy has completely transformed the way that we take care of cancer patients, and that would not have happened without the patients dedicating themselves to making cancer care better by participating in a research study.
Do cancer clinical trials differ from other clinical trials?
A cancer clinical trial is a research study where we test new and different ways of taking care of some of the common cancers that we deal with. Cancer clinical trials can differ from some of the other clinical trials in that cancer clinical trials generally involve patients with cancer. Some of the other clinical trial entities are done in healthy volunteers.
Why is it important to consider participating in a trial?
The best care for cancer patients happens in clinical trials. You're getting access to the newest and most innovative therapies, and the amount of attention that you get as a patient is much more so than with standard therapies, just because you have a complete research team that's looking after you and making sure that you're having a good experience while on the research study. Beyond just people paying attention to you, you're getting access to the most innovative and cutting edge therapies. You can get access to therapies before they're FDA approved by participating in a clinical trial, and a lot of times those therapies will turn out to be better than what's readily available on the market.
How do I even know if there's a trial that's right for me?
We commonly hear from patients that they wish they had known that this particular trial was going on before they committed to some standard of care option. To find out whether there's a clinical trial that fits your particular clinical scenario, the first thing to do is ask your doctor. There are also resources through various cancer support groups, such as those for stomach cancers, those for esophageal cancers, those for pancreatic cancers, those for colon cancers, that you can reach out to support groups in those areas and they will help you find a clinical trial that fits your particular clinical needs. In general, you're going to have to work with your doctor because they have the best ideas about what clinical trial would fit your particular cancer stage that you're dealing with.
Am I guaranteed to get the study drug?
In some studies where we're comparing the standard of care to something that's new, you might get the standard of care versus the standard of care plus the new therapy. On some other clinical trials, you're guaranteed to get everything. You'll get the standard of care plus the new therapy, and some of them you get the new therapy by itself. But it depends on the stage of the clinical trial that we're dealing with.
What if I get a placebo? I don't want to waste my time and let my cancer get worse.
It's unusual to have a cancer clinical trial that involves a placebo where you get nothing else. Most often, it's the standard of care plus a placebo being compared with the standard of care plus a new therapy. But I would definitely ask your oncologist about that specific question before you sign up for any clinical trial. If you're not comfortable with the choices on the clinical trial that you are considering, definitely talk to your oncologist about your concerns, and other options can be provided to you.
At what point in my journey should I consider a trial?
I would definitely ask about clinical trials no matter where you are in your cancer journey. At almost any stage in a patient's cancer journey, there should be a clinical trial available. We have clinical trials available for patients who are undergoing screening. We have clinical trials available for patients who have been newly diagnosed. We have clinical trials available for the patients who are dealing with different stages of cancer. And we even have clinical trials available for those that have achieved cure and are in survivorship and follow-up.
What if I can't get to a major cancer center?
We need to do a better job of getting clinical trials to the community where the patients are. One of the goals that we have at major medical centers is bringing cancer care to the local community so that patients, no matter where they are, should have access to clinical trials. A lot of health systems, including ours, have outreach networks where clinical trials are actually available in the community, but should be able to definitely ask your provider about access to clinical trials, either where you're getting your care or is there a large academic medical center that's near you that you could have easy access to.
Why does diversity matter in clinical trials?
It's important that patients from all backgrounds and ethnicities participate in clinical trials because once a drug is approved, it's approved for everyone. And if you didn't have participants from a variety of backgrounds in those clinical trials, we're not 100% certain that that drug will work in the same way that it does for the majority of patients that were in the clinical trial. So it's really important that we get the full spectrum of patient participation in clinical trials.
Do most trials have adequate representation?
Currently, there are certain populations of patients that are not well represented on clinical trials. For example, African Americans represent about 12% of the United States population, but only 5% of participants in clinical trials are African American. Therefore, there could be nuances in side effects or efficacy that we're not able to detect on standard clinical trials because we don't have participation of African American patients.
Are there cancers where this is especially important?
Yes, for certain cancers, ethnic background is particularly important, as certain cancers are more common in certain ethnicities and can actually behave quite differently and be more aggressive in certain ethnicities. Gastric cancers in an Asian population can differ considerably from a Western population. The cancers occur in different locations in the GI tract, and they can also behave differently from an aggressiveness standpoint and also from a response to therapy standpoint. There's some medications that are approved in Asia that are not approved in the United States because they weren't effective in a US population.
Why do you think representation is so low for some of these groups?
It's not unusual to hear the complaint, I would have been willing to participate in a clinical trial if a study had been available where I was receiving my initial care. Quite often, research studies are conducted in the big medical centers in the big cities, and that's not where the patients necessarily reside. We have to make sure that we are providing clinical trial access with our various academic networks so that patients have access to those particular research studies. That's one of the main problems that leads to underrepresentation and lower participation of patients in clinical trials because they don't have a research study where they live.
What are the downsides of being in a trial?
By participating in a clinical trial, it's not all upside necessarily. You could get exposed to a therapy that is not effective or a therapy that has more toxicities than the standard of care. Also, there are commitments that are made as being part of a clinical trial. You may have more clinic visits than you would have under standard of care, and may have to travel further, especially if you don't have the clinical trial available down the street from you and you have to travel an hour to a medical center to get treated. And those are all things that need to be considered when one is signing up to participate in a research study.
Am I going to be a guinea pig?
You are not going to be a guinea pig. The research protocol has to go through a several step process to make sure that it is a scientifically valid study in that we're not subjecting patients to a therapy that has no chance of working. And we also have it reviewed by the institutional review board, and their job is to make sure that the study is ethical to conduct and to make sure that the study is safe to conduct so that we're not putting patients at risk. Many clinical trials in oncology are not looking necessarily at a brand new drug. Sometimes the studies are looking at new ways to give an existing drug or a drug that's approved in a different indication. Sometimes a drug that's, say, approved in breast cancer is being looked at in colon cancer. And as a clinical trial participant, you're going to be the most cared for patient in the medical center. You're going to have an entire team that's dedicated to make sure that you have a good experience, and we're monitoring your toxicities so that nothing untoward will happen to you while you're participating in the study that we are not keeping track of.
Will my privacy be protected?
It is a law that patient privacy must be protected. So even if you're participating in a research study, your privacy will be protected. If a clinical trial is being supported by the institution or being supported by a pharmaceutical company, some information will be shared with those entities. However, that information is coded where it is not the patient's name or date of birth and other essential identifying information that's being shared. It's other information. The patients are assigned a number, and the supporting entity will know the diagnosis and when the diagnosis was made and some other details about the cancer, but they won't have identifying information for you as a participant.
What about the cost?
Participating in a research study should be of no cost to you in comparison to standard of care. The cost for the study drugs should be absorbed by the institution or by the research entity that's conducting that particular clinical trial. The cost to you should not be anything above the standard of care. If you have more visits to the medical center because of the clinical trial, you may have more parking fees and sometimes more fees to check into the clinic. But again, quite often those can be taken care of by the research entity.
If I do say yes to a trial, am I locked in?
Once you've agreed to participate in a research study, you're not locked in. You're a volunteer. And so you can withdraw at any time. If there's a point where you don't feel comfortable, definitely tell your research team that you don't feel comfortable continuing or you don't want to continue for whatever reason, and they will respect that and continue to provide the best possible care for you whether you're on the study or not.
If I'm in a trial, will I still see my regular oncologist?
When you're participating in a study, most of the time you can stay with your regular oncologist. There are some particular studies that, because of the intensity of the treatment or because it's a brand new therapy, you might have to see a provider that specializes in the care of those particular patients.
What advice do you have for someone newly diagnosed?
Try to make an informed decision as much as possible. I do recommend that patients reach out to some of the acknowledged support groups that have a good reputation in the cancer community. Many of the participants in those particular support groups have prior experience with cancer and can give excellent advice.
What kinds of questions should I be asking?
If you're participating in a research study, one of the important questions to ask is, am I receiving the standard of care in addition to an added study medication? In addition to that, one should ask, is this additional study medication a brand new drug, or is this drug already approved in another indication, such as breast cancer, or in a non-cancer scenario where this drug has been given to thousands and thousands of patients and is proven to be safe? And what have been the toxicities that have been seen in these other scenarios so far?
What if I'm on the fence about a trial?
I would definitely have conversations with your physician. I definitely have conversations with your family about what's needed for you to do to be a participant in that clinical trial and to make sure that you're comfortable with all the different aspects of participating in a research study, the travel, the potential side effects, and the potential outcomes that you could see, whether those are positive or negative.
Do you have any final thoughts?
Any patient who is going through the cancer experience should ask their provider about the availability of clinical trials. There are going to be different clinical trials depending on what kinds of cancer that someone is dealing with, and some scenarios there may not be a clinical trial that fits. But you should definitely ask your provider about the availability of clinical trials for whatever stage of cancer or whatever part of the cancer journey that you're on.
Dr. Lockhart, thank you for your time, and thank you to our audience.